Hey everyone, welcome back to learning about the ALU Sprint system with myself, Mark, and Andrew.
Hey.
This video we're going to be talking about the progress tracker and what you do over the course of a sprint once you've started. So Andrew, when does the sprint start?
So the sprint starts right after the planning meeting. As soon as that thing is over, you're up and sprinting.
Great. And how do you know what you should be doing and working on during the course of the sprint?
Right, so in the planning meeting, you each were assigned cards. And those cards are a particular task that you're trying to get done over the course of that sprint, and your name's on it, so you're responsible for doing it. So leaving from that planning meeting, maybe you actually got into creating those actual cards in your planning meeting and putting your names on them, or maybe it's left up for you to create them now that you've finished up your planning meeting. But the first step for you is for each of those cards to go into your progress tracker, which we tend to use Asana for ours. And within that progress tracker, you will fully fill out your card. So you'll see kind of one of the first columns in your progress tracker is cards being filled out. And for filling out a card, there's a few key things you want to have. You want to have the story of what the problem is that you're trying to solve. You want to have an idea of the solution that you're going to create with this task during this sprint. Then you want to have some acceptance criteria. So articulate clearly objective, measurable standards that if you meet them, then it's considered that this task has been acceptable and it is sufficient to achieve that solution that you're talking about. An example could be, well, if we want to implement a new policy around a student life endeavor, then you want to make sure that it's a high quality draft of that policy, that you've had a chance for members of the student life team to review it and sign off on it, that the head of student life has approved it, that the legal office has approved it. If those 4 acceptance criteria are met, then you can say this is a viable new policy, just as an example of what those acceptance criteria could look like. Another helpful thing that you can do is you can list out different tasks that you may want to do in the function within Asana or Trello or kind of any system that you're using to track your cards. And that's really useful because it helps you plan what sort of work you might want to do. And then also when your team lead reviews the card, which is the next step, once you've completed it and placed it in the next column of review, then they can suggest other things that you might want to do. And it's a really easy way to get visibility on your game plan for this particular project.
Yeah, so I'm hearing that a card normally has 4 components. The problem statement, sometimes called the user story, the solution, the acceptance criteria, and the tasks. Yeah, and which part are you held accountable for, the tasks or the acceptance criteria?
So the acceptance criteria.
Okay.
Ultimately, the acceptance criteria is the goal that you're trying to hit. You want to make sure that you create something that has each of those different criteria and that they're fully met. If you lay out 3 or 4 tasks that you intend to do, but then you decide, oh, actually 2 of those aren't necessary to complete this in an acceptable way that meets the acceptance criteria, it's fine to do different tasks. You're not going to be held accountable to specifically the route that you took. It's much more about the outcome that you produce.
And do you change that card during the sprint? Any parts of the card?
No. So that card, once you set it up and once it gets approved by your project lead, that's what you're working on. And that's key for getting alignment within the team. If you say in the meeting, hey, I'm going to work on the new grading policy for the learning team, and then all of a sudden you start working on dress code policy instead. Like, clearly it has nothing to do with what you actually were supposed to be working on. It wouldn't meet the acceptance criteria, and it's important to make sure that everybody's working on the thing they're supposed to be working on and not just suddenly veering in a different direction.
Awesome. Yeah, and then what are the stages that card would go through?
Right. So in the planning meeting, you get assigned to a card. You then leave from that and you move it from maybe backlog cards, or perhaps you have to create the card itself, into card being filled out. And within that column is when you're working on filling out that card completely. Once you've filled it out completely to what you think is good, you move it into the next column, which is review. So in review, your product owner or the lead for this kind of priority area or this team will go in and they will look and they will say, okay, is this the problem we're trying to solve? Is there a solution? Does that seem appropriate? How are their acceptance criteria? Are these objective and measurable such that at the end of the sprint you can evaluate how well you achieved that? And then they might look at any tasks that you come up with and make some suggestions of additional things to do. If they find that all of that is a good card, it's fully filled out, it has all of the criteria that you need, they will then move it over into in progress. And at that point, you are free to run and do all the work, to work through your tasks, to try and achieve that card. They might make some comments on things to change, and if you need to see those changes, they'll often move it back into filling out card completely so that you can fix those things, move it back into review. Once it's fixed, then you can move into the in progress. In progress is where the cards will sit for most of the sprint while you're doing your actual work over the course of those, say, 2 weeks, if it's a 2-week sprint. And whenever you complete that card, then you're going to upload all of your work as attachments to that card itself. So if you're creating a draft, attach it to that card. If you needed to get approval from somebody, take a screenshot of that email, add it to that card. If there's anything else that you need to support and demonstrate that you've met the acceptance criteria, add it to the card. And once you have everything complete, move it into the under review column. And so that review will happen by your project lead, ideally before the retrospective. You may have a particular way of working where at least an hour before the retrospective, all the cards need to be in if they want to be reviewed, so that your team lead has time to review it before that next meeting actually happens. If they look at it and they say, okay, here are the 4 acceptance criteria, you have met those 4 acceptance criteria, you've shown me the documentation for it, then they will move it over into complete, and everybody celebrates because you did a great job and you've completed your task.
Awesome. Yeah, I really like that piece around attaching everything to the card because it makes a little packet of information all around that task. I remember, so on our team we archive all of our cards.
Right.
So if someone says, I don't remember giving you my approval on that, I can open up my progress tracker, go back and say, actually on February 22nd, I have a record of you giving approval on that.
Right.
So it makes you seem like you're always on top of everything. If you attach everything to cards and then archive them, you literally have records of all the work that your team is doing, which, try and find an ineffective team that has records. No, they don't.
Yeah.
Because they're infected.
And likewise, you have the flip side of that. As a manager, it gives you a lot of security because if suddenly you have a plan for, okay, somebody needs to go and maybe have an interview with a set of 3 students about their experience on something, and then all of a sudden you hear that they're setting up an interview with the president of Mauritius and sending emails to their team. You're like, wait a second, hold up. This is not what we described in the task. This is not how we set the acceptance criteria. This is nothing that we were planning.
Exactly.
And it gives you as a manager kind of some comfort in saying, well, your team can go out and they can do and they can feel empowered or really be empowered. But then if something goes awry and they do something they're totally not supposed to do, then you can rest on knowing, well, this is what I told them to do and here's the record of it, so I don't know why they decided to do X, Y, Z crazy thing.
Exactly, yeah. And then the last question I have is there like a required way that your team has to be working during the course of the sprint, or?
So during the course of the sprint, there are expectations that you talk about kind of in that planning meeting sometimes, and in your team handbook is where a lot of these are laid out. And so if, say, you're going to have a regular daily check-in, in your handbook that would describe where and when those things happen. If you're going to have a routine stand-up meeting or anything like that, then that's all detailed in that team handbook.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what I think is interesting is different agile teams, it seems like they could look really different.
Mm-hmm.
So one team, maybe it actually works for them to just have the planning meeting, say, peace, I'll see you in 2 weeks, and then come back to the retrospective, and that's actually valid if it's working. Yeah. Other teams might meet multiple times throughout the day, and it's whatever works for your team.
Right, exactly.
Awesome. So catch us next time, I guess, for our video about the retrospective. So when the sprint comes to a close, how do you handle that? Tune in next time. Yeah, we'll find out. Awesome. That one, I don't know, maybe we cut out some parts of that.
Yeah.